Hi, I'm Morey-Wu. Thank you so much for joining me for the next 30 minutes to hear about an Agile intro to Agile. A little bit about myself first. I've been in startup and enterprise companies for quite a few years. I spent a number of years in San Francisco Bay Area startups, kind of honing my Agile techniques, and more recently I moved to Atlassian, who makes productivity software like Jira, Confluence, and Trello. I started working in Agile methodologies in 2009 when I moved to the Bay Area to work for LucasArts, which is the video games wing of Lucasfilm. There I worked on a new IP team, IP being intellectual property. So what that means at LucasArts is nothing Star Wars, nothing Indiana Jones. So I was working with small 2 to 5 person teams who were iterating and developing small game ideas to put on Xbox Live. At the time, leadership said to us, well, you should use Agile development. It's this new thing. I'm like, okay, kind of read about it, don't really know what it is. So I went off to GDC, which is the Game Developers Conference, did the Scrum Master certification, came back and also got some contracting money to have that trainer come and train the rest of my team on how to use these methodologies. So I've been doing Agile, Scrum, Kanban, other methodologies since then, and continue to learn, get more certifications, and continue to, as one would in Agile, iterate on what I know about these methodologies. So I'd love to share some of that with you today. As I mentioned, this is going to be an Agile approach to Agile, so I'm going to define a couple of terms for you first. The first is an epic. So an epic is a large body of work that can be broken down into smaller tasks. So in software development, that's a feature that you're working on as part of your software. And then a story, which is also called a user story, is short requirements, or can also be translated into a task, which is written from the perspective of an end user. It's usually something like, as a user, I want to click on this button to add this to my shopping cart, for example. So that's what a story is. So applying this to the overview of the presentation today, normally this would be the slide where I'd say, here's the overview and here's the things I'm going to tell you. Instead of an overview, I'm going to give you my backlog. This is my backlog of what we're going to talk about today. Our first epic is going to be, what is Agile? And the user stories underneath that. Not enough space to put in as a user, etc. here, but the user stories are the definition of Agile, philosophy, manifesto, and what Agile isn't. So that's our first epic. Our second epic is going to be the methodologies. I'm going to highlight 2 of the most popular ones, which are Scrum and Kanban, and also talk about Waterfall, which is not an Agile methodology, but it's interesting to help use that as a comparison to the different methodologies of Scrum and Kanban. Then the final epic I'll finish off with is how to choose between all of these. So here we start with our first epic. Our first user story is, what is Agile? So Agile, I'm going to read this out, is a time-boxed, iterative approach that builds software incrementally, instead of trying to deliver it all at once near the end. Now I'm going to show you a visual to kind of explain this a little bit better than just a few words on a screen. So this is a visualization of what Waterfall is, or what I like to call what we did before Agile. In Waterfall, you do lots of analysis and requirements writing up front. Then you do a bunch of design, you do your UI, UX, wireframes, all of those things. Then finally, you throw it over the wall to the engineers and say, go ahead and program that for us, throw it over to QA, and then eventually gets released. So it's a lot of time in each phase and handed on to the next phase. This can be anywhere from a couple of months to a year or several years in this time period. What Agile does is turns that literally on its side. So it says, you know what, I don't want to wait a few months or a year or 2 to find out what my software is going to look like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, what's the smallest piece of software we can develop that brings the highest level of value to the customer? So I'm going to kind of write up the requirements, do the designs, code it, test it, and say, hey, after a time period, here's the first piece of the software. Product owner, the person who requested the software, stakeholders, what do you think? What's the feedback on this? They get the feedback, they're like, great, do this. This is the next piece we want. So you go ahead and go to your next thin slice here, do some analysis, design, coding, testing. You've got your next iteration of the working software. You bring it back to the product owner, the person who requested the feature, and say, what do you think? And you continually have this feedback cycle, delivering something that's working software as soon as possible to continue getting that feedback, validating if you're going in the right direction, to make sure you're delivering the right thing, versus potentially with the waterfall method, you can get to the end of a few months or even a year, deliver that to your customer, and they say, that's not what I was looking for, because you didn't have those early feedback cycles. So that's a really good way to contrast waterfall to agile methodologies. So if we jump back in these slides briefly and look at what is agile, so it's time boxed. You saw those little time periods. It's iterative. You're delivering something and getting that feedback cycle going. So it builds that software incrementally instead of delivering it all at once at the end like waterfall would. Okay, jumping forward in our slides now. So our next user story here is Agile is a philosophy. So it's a philosophy, and a lot of development frameworks and techniques fall under what I call the Agile umbrella. Under that umbrella of philosophy are all sorts of things like lean development, extreme programming, pair programming, TDD, which is test-driven development, and two of the most popular ones you've probably heard of, which are Scrum and Kanban. So remember, big umbrella philosophy, lots of techniques and frameworks underneath that philosophy. There is a manifesto for Agile. I know this sounds a bit woo-woo, but there is. So the concept of iterative development has been around for a long time, since the 1950s. The idea of Scrum started in the 1990s, and then in 2001, 17 people got together and wrote this manifesto. You can look it up on the internet. It's at agilemanifesto.org. I'm going to read through it and then kind of talk you through to explain the concepts here. So the manifesto says, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and finally, responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there's value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So to break this down, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So instead of having that super long plan, we deliver software at the end, you say, hey, we're showing you things on a constant basis because we want feedback from you as individuals to influence where the software is going. And by the way, we have working software every time period, whatever we call our, the length of time that we're delivering a piece of software each time. And we'd rather deliver that to you than lots of documents that don't really give you that hands-on experience of what your end product is going to look like. We believe in collaborating with the software, doing those demos at the end of each time period with that working software to find out what they think. And you're able to respond to change of following a plan, because each time you demo that software, the customer has a chance to give feedback. You've got a feedback cycle. You can potentially change the direction you're going in because you are able to collaborate with the customer and respond to change fairly rapidly. So there's a few things that Agile is not. It is not a way to fix team health. It's not a quick fix. If your team health is bad, if there's disagreements and people aren't collaborating, Agile's not going to necessarily make that better. It's also not a reason never to have a deadline or plan longer than a sprint. And sprint, just as a reminder, is a time period that you're using to deliver software in. You can look at how much work your team usually gets done in a sprint, what's called the team's velocity. Then you can project out over several sprints how much work you can get done and say, hey, over 5 sprints, we think we'll get around about this work done. And so this is what our release plan is. So you can definitely plan out longer than a sprint using Agile methodologies. Finally, it's not an excuse to have zero documentation. Whilst it says conversation over documentation in that manifesto, it means not super long pages and pages of docs, but you still need to do commenting in code and writing up a few Confluence pages to give people context about why you're doing what you're doing, to make sure the next person who touches the code has context and understands what's going on. So documentation light is what I would call Agile methodologies. Okay, so we have reached the end of our first epic. What I'm showing you here is a Kanban backlog. Over here, and I'll explain Kanban in just after this slide. We've got the things we haven't worked on yet, but we are done. We have finished our epic. We've finished all the stories in our epic. They're in the done column. The next thing we're going to move into the in progress column is the epic about methodologies. We're going to talk about Scrum, Kanban, and Waterfall. So Kanban. The word Kanban is Japanese. Roughly translated, it means card you can see, or billboard. Now, the concept of Kanban comes out of the Toyota car manufacturing industry. You're like, cars? What's that have to do with software? Well, let me tell you a little bit of a story. So imagine you're somebody on the factory floor running a system that's developing widget 1, and your executive A has told you, we really need widget 1, we need 5,000 of widget 1. So you're developing widget 1. Halfway through, executive B comes down to the factory floor and says, no, we want widget 2. We don't want widget 1. Stop what you're doing and change over. So you're like, okay, they're more important than me. I'll just do what they tell me to. So you stop the production line, you retool, you start making widget 2. And executive A comes back and says, wait, why are you making widget 2? I asked for widget 1. You're like, I don't know how to prioritize between both of you. I don't know what to do. So the concept of Kanban came from that frustration. So this is a Kanban backlog, similar to what you saw in that previous slide. And what Kanban says is, you know what, executives or people who are directing the work, see this backlog here? Each of these cards represents a request for widgets, and you can keep changing those priorities as much as you want in this backlog before the work goes into progress. Then once the work goes into progress and widget 1 is being made, you can't change that. You can change the priorities in the backlog, but once it's in progress, it's super inefficient to stop the production line, retool, or if you translate it to software, to context switch from one task to another task, which we all know that context switching wastes a whole lot of time. So it gave them a way to allow senior folks to change priorities on the fly, but not interrupt that work in progress so that it reduced waste in the way they were going about things. Okay, so let's do kind of the technical side of Kanban. So there are just a few rituals. Grooming of the backlog. So this is your backlog here, the work that you haven't started on. Grooming just means making sure things are in the right priority and that there's the right information in the tickets. So you'll groom that backlog to make sure it's ready to be taken to in progress. The other ritual is Kaizen, which is also called self-improvement. Kaizen means, if you're familiar with the concept of a retrospective, it's looking back. The team every couple of weeks will say, hey, how are we doing as a team? You know, what should we improve upon? What went well? What do we want to change for next time? So those are the two rituals involved in in Kanban. There's only one artifact, which is this backlog here. Pretty straightforward. There is one tenet, which is to limit the work in progress. You can see in this board, there are 3 people working on this particular board, Sun, Rob, and Jane, and they only have 1 card each. That means that it's very visible as to what that team is working on at any point in time. If Sun had 3 tickets, you're like, I don't know what Sun is even working on. So if Sun gets blocked on something, they can always put a ticket back into the to-do column, take something out, but always just have that one thing in progress so it's very visible and we know what is being worked on at any point in time. Okay, so what is Kanban good for? It is great for experimentation. It's great for doing research projects where you're still figuring out what direction you're going in. You just have some ideas you want to throw in a backlog. It's really good for teams who do firefighting because priorities change very quickly when you're firefighting. And Kanban is great for smaller units of work. You'll see that why in the next bullet. Some of the challenges of Kanban is if you have larger work, it can block up that queue. Remember those widgets? Maybe 5,000 widgets is too many to do at a time, and that's going to take 3 weeks. And really you want to have cards for 1,000 widgets each so that those executives can kind of make those trade-off decisions and things are moving fairly quickly through the pipeline. To bring that back to software development, you really want to have tasks that are only like a half day to 2 days maximum. Any longer than that, then it blocks up that pipeline and things don't flow through. That reprioritization process is not taken advantage of. So you really need to think about if it's bigger than that to try and break it down into smaller pieces. There's also no such thing as a Kanban roadmap. Because that reprioritization can take place at any time in the backlog, it's not possible to predict timelines. So if you're looking for a tool or a methodology to predict longer term timelines, Kanban may not be the right methodology for you to choose. So Scrum, this is our next user story. When Jeff Sutherland created the concept of Scrum in the early 90s, he borrowed the term Scrum from an anthology which was put forth by a 1986 study by Takeuchi and Nonaka. It was published in the Harvard Business Review. And in that study, they compared high-performing cross-functional teams to the Scrum formation used in rugby teams. And so when you think about the stand-up we're going to talk about, that's kind of that huddle that you see rugby teams doing. So in Scrum, there's a couple rituals. There's the time box sprints. So sprints is just a way of naming the time box that you're going to develop software in. They're usually anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. The most common time period is 2 weeks, so you'll probably hear me talking about 2-week sprints as we continue in this conversation. There are a bunch of Scrum ceremonies. They're called ceremonies because ceremonies are well understood rituals, just like a wedding. A wedding, you're probably going to have 2 people. You're going to have an official person who's going to perform the ceremony. There might be a ring, depending upon what culture you're in. But it's a well-known, understood thing that when you go in, you know the basic agenda, so to speak. So just like that, the Scrum ceremonies have a common agenda for each of the meetings. So in sprint planning, your agenda is, what are we going to do in the sprint? How much time do we have? Do we have any days off, etc.? How much work can we bring into the sprint? What's the most important thing that we want to work on? So that's what happens in sprint planning. And I'll just show you, this is what a sprint board looks like once the work starts. So while we're in this flow of moving cards across the board during the sprint, we'll have stand-up on a daily basis. Now back to that, rugby team kind of doing that huddle. The stand-up is that same concept where the team once a day, if you're physically in person, you stand up. If not, you can do it virtually. You can do it async on Slack. But you're making commitments to each other. You're saying, this is what I did yesterday. This is what I'm going to do today. And this is what I'm blocked on, if anything. Now, each of the team members then have a responsibility to listen and support each other if there's something blocking them, if they can help out. But that's what the stand-up is about. Next up is the grooming meeting. So the grooming meeting is about halfway to 3/4 of the way through the sprint cycle. And in the grooming meeting, we look at the tasks that are in the backlog that are not in the current sprint. So the work that hasn't been started. And the team works together. The product owner, the person who's requesting the work, describes what's involved in each of those stories or tasks. The team asks questions to clarify those. They estimate against them so that they know that when they get to their sprint planning, they'll be able to say, we understand the work and we're deciding this is how much we're bringing into the sprint. Finally, we have a review or a demonstration meeting where you say, hey, at the end of the sprint, here's the working software developed. Here to the stakeholders are invited. Anybody in the company that is interested in what you're doing is welcome to come to the review or the demonstration meeting to see that working software, give feedback and so on to help inform what goes into the next sprint. Then finally, the retrospective is a team-only sport. The retrospective is all about how are we collaborating process-wise as a team? What worked in the last sprint? What didn't work? And is there anything we want to tweak or change for the next sprint? So that's a quick overview of the Scrum ceremonies. The artifacts that you have in Scrum are pretty straightforward. There's a backlog. You've got your product backlog, which is all the work that hasn't been brought into the sprint. And then we have the sprint backlog, which is specific to the task the team picked up to work on in this 2-week time period. You also have what's called a burn down chart. Now this shows work the team chose to take on. The gray line shows how it should ideally, how much work should get burned down or completed over time. And then this red line shows, oh, somebody finished a story, it went down, okay, nothing got finished, oh, something else has been finished. So it's showing the completion or the burn down of the work at hand. This is what a really healthy team's burn down chart would look like. So just to kind of visually bring this together, I mentioned we have the product backlog. Each time the team picks up an increment of that backlog and creates their sprint backlog. We have that sprint and on the daily Scrum meeting, which happens every single day during that sprint, and at the end of it, we have a working product increment. So what is Scrum good for? It's great for building brand new products. It gives a level of stability. You've got that planning, you know what's happening in 2 weeks. You can make that longer term release plan when you're using Scrum. It's useful when projects have semi-stable requirements. If you're still really in the blue as to what you're making, I would suggest using Kanban for that kind of research phase. You can use more than one methodology when you're working in a software project. You can change the methodology to suit the phase that you're in. Scrum is amazing in giving high visibility. Every couple of weeks, you're delivering working software, and they can see what's going on, give feedback, and make sure things are going in the direction that they're hoping for. And finally, it also allows you to change that direction quickly and safely, because at the end of each sprint, you say, here's what we did. And the stakeholders can say, that's fabulous. We want, that's great. We want to do this, or this, like, interesting. I think that thing we were going to do like 3 months out, I want to bring that forward and do that earlier, because I think that's going to work really well with the direction we want to go in. So it lets you change that direction really quickly and safely. Some of the challenges, though, there's always pros and cons to everything, is that your final product might be different than planned because you've made those choices. You've brought that, that other piece forward 3 months. Some people might consider the scope creep. I think this is actually the process working properly. It also really importantly requires training and buy-in from both the team and the leadership. You need to have an in-depth understanding of how these rituals work to be successful in them. It's important your leadership supports you in using Scrum, because once you start working on that sprint, nobody's supposed to interrupt or change what's in that sprint. And if you have a leader who doesn't understand that, they might come in and say, hey, I really need this other thing done. Can you just add that to your sprint? You're like, why don't we put that in the backlog and prioritize that for the next sprint? Now, if that leader understands, they'll realize that they're risking a sprint by trying to add something to it and potentially causing overtime or churn. They'll be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, put it in the backlog. If they don't, then they'll say, no, just shove it in, and it just kind of breaks down the structure of the way Scrum is supposed to work. So ideally, leadership at least needs some high-level understanding of how Scrum works as well as the team. Okay, our final user story in this epic is Waterfall, what we did before Agile. So here's another visual waterfall, which really shows you why it's called waterfall, because you do each section, each working area, and move on to the next. So you're doing a whole bunch of analysis. Then you're doing some design. Then you're doing coding. You don't go back and forth. You just do the one thing to the next thing to the next thing, then you're done. So Waterfall also has a bunch of rituals. It has a lot of planning involved that we've just talked about. It has things like risk management meetings. It's a very top-down kind of experience. I used to work at Electronic Arts. I worked on the product FIFA, which is the football or soccer game, depending upon what country you're in. And our risk management meetings were pretty dire. The biggest risk that we had, we would ship the software on the last day of the quarter. And as long as it shipped on that day, we would capture the revenue, no matter when the game sold, in that quarter that it shipped on that day. So our biggest risk was if we miss our ship date by 1 day, our stock price will fall. Good times. Let's just say if we really needed something from another team, we got it from another team. There's also gate reviews. Again, when I was working on FIFA, that was a very full meeting with senior executives where you'd say, we're at the end of milestone 2, here's all the documentation to show what we've done, etc. It was all very kind of paper heavy. It wasn't really about showing the actual working software. It was about showing the plans you have and if you've met those plans. So Waterfall tends to be a very kind of heavy top-down kind of process instead of the more team orientation that Scrum and Kanban have. There's a lot of artifacts. There's project requirement definitions, there's implementation plans, there's Gantt charts, there's test plans, test reports, milestone reports, lots of reports. I used to write while I was working on FIFA, a TPS report. For those of you who are fans of the movie The Office, TPS stands for Test Plan Summary in this situation. For the record, there was no cover sheet. It was a digital report, so no cover sheet. Anyway, and this is a visualization of what a Gantt chart would look like when you're doing something like a waterfall development. You can see it's very kind of going down that waterfall right there. So what is Waterfall good for? It's great for projects where somebody could die due to a bug. Right? If you really need to do some extra planning, if it's something like medical software, that might be the right thing to do. It's also really great for repeatable and known projects with not very many uncertainties, but there are some challenges. It's rare that all the requirements are known up front, and the requirements can tend to change. And that can, if you've said, oh, we're going to deliver on April 6th, and all of a sudden you get more information like April 6th is off the table, you had that false sense of security about the outcome that it doesn't allow for. It also takes a really long time for your product folks and your stakeholders to see tangible results. And back to FIFA as an example, when I was working on FIFA, they were redoing the way the players move around on the field. And so they took out the mechanics that let them do that. So the players, when you turn on the game, were like all over the place. You couldn't literally play the game until the 3rd milestone. And it was only a 3-milestone project. And until then, you weren't able to play the game to see how the game was progressing because they were making that huge software change. And so because of that, it was really hard for us to know how the game was looking and if it was going to be a success or not. Here's another way to look at the contrast between Waterfall and Scrum. So here's a Waterfall task backlog. You can see every single task is detailed. This is early on in the project, this is later on in the project, and everything is detailed to a very deep level of detail. Versus if you look at a Scrum task backlog, you can see for the first sprint and maybe the next sprint or two, you've got a lot of detail in task backlog. But the further down that you go, the less detail there is. You've got a high-level plan. You know where you're going. You've got your high-level epics. You haven't written out all those user stories yet because you don't know if you might change directions or pick up something in a different order. So you can see potentially in a waterfall task backlog, maybe we decide this work isn't worth doing or we want to go in a different direction. And in Scrum, there would be little wasted time because of that. But in Waterfall, you actually end up with more waste. So it's another principle of Agile is to reduce waste. And so by only detailing out things early on and leaving it high level towards the end, you're able to reduce that waste. Okay, we have finished our second epic, methodologies. So now we're going to move on to our final epic, which is how to choose. You've learned a whole bunch of different things. How do we put this into practice? So here's a matrix that you can use to think about things. First of all, is it a small project or is it a large project? And is it high certainty or low certainty? Like, do you know a lot about it? Or is it complex with a lot of risk? Then it might be low certainty. So if it's something like just updating some graphics on a web page, I would call that a small project and high certainty. You know what you're doing. It's not going to take too long. You might not need any methodology at all. If it's like 15 or 20 graphics, then maybe you want to do a Kanban backlog or a to-do list to help you manage that, to be thorough, make sure you check off all the boxes, but you just need some sort of lightweight methodology. If it's a small project and low certainty, such as a research project into a technology your team's thinking adopting, but you haven't really experienced yet, then Kanban is a great tool to use because it's got lightweight methodology, but you've got that backlog of tasks you can keep adding to and changing priorities and so on. It'll help give visibility to other people as to what you're doing. So Kanban's the perfect choice for some sort of small, low certainty research project. What if it's a high certainty large project? Something like a port of a video game from Xbox to PC, and you've done this before, so it's a fairly knowable thing. You know what the risks are, you know how to handle them. Then in that situation, either Scrum or Waterfall would work, whichever you're more comfortable with. But if it's a large project with low certainty, so you're developing brand new software that you haven't done before, that's where I think Scrum really excels because it gives you that plan, but allows you to adapt to change and helps you manage risk by giving you stopping points to stop, reconsider, and make new choices based on the information that you've learned over the course of the previous sprint. So feel free to take a quick screenshot of this and use this as kind of a resource for you to think about in the future. All right, we have done it. We have gone through all 3 epics, what is Agile, the methodologies, and how to choose. To wrap things up, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation that I've been having with you today. If you want to learn more about Agile methodologies or Scrum, there's a lot of information on the internet. There's great Scrum Master training courses. I will also be at the PM72 social event, the US-centric one, which is going to be on Monday the 13th of June from 3:30 to 5:30 Pacific time. So I would love to see you there. Happy to chat, answer any questions, and get feedback on our conversation today. Thank you so much.